In this quiet hollow of Campbell County stands what remains of the Honeycutt place. In 1977, federal agents stormed this compound and carried away its patriarch, Raymond Honeycutt, a self-taught electrician accused.
Between July 15th and September 8, 1978, 13 law enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by members of Honeycutt clan, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for arresting family patriarch Ezra Honeycutt during raid on family compound in Hawkins County, Tennessee, raid that had been conducted by combined federal and state task force investigating alleged firearms violations. But that had escalated into violent confrontation when 73-year-old Ezra had been forcibly removed from property, while grandchildren watched officers employing tactics that clan members characterized as excessive force against elderly man whose resistance had been verbal, rather than physical. Arrest that had resulted in Ezra suffering broken ribs and concussion from officers' handling during transportation, to county jail, where he'd been denied medical treatment for injuries, until family's attorney had threatened litigation, forcing authorities to acknowledge that prisoner required hospitalization. By September 12th, all 13 officers who'd participated in raid or who'd been involved in Ezra's arrest or who'd denied medical care were dead. Their bodies discovered throughout northeastern Tennessee, where coordinated actions by multiple Honeycutt clan members had systematically hunted and killed law enforcement personnel through electrocution methods, demonstrating that when authorities employ excessive force against respected family leaders, and when systems refuse accountability for injuries inflicted during arrests, that legal, authority authorized, but that specific tactics exceeded, then family groups will deliver retribution that institutions declined to provide, even when evidence documented that officers had violated policies prohibiting unnecessary violence against suspects who weren't presenting immediate threats justifying aggressive subduing techniques. Hawkins County, Tennessee, occupied 487 square miles of rolling hill country in northeastern corner of state in 1978, populated by approximately 44,000 people working in agriculture, manufacturing, and service industries that regional economy supported. Conservative rural area, where extended families often maintained close relationships, and where insular communities sometimes developed around patriarchal figures whose authority within family groups exceeded that of external institutions, including government agencies whose interventions in family matters were often viewed with suspicion or resistance. The region had experienced social changes during 1960s, 1970s, when federal authority had expanded into areas that local populations had traditionally controlled, changes that had created tensions between government enforcement and communities that valued autonomy, and that resisted what they perceived as intrusions into private affairs that families should resolve internally rather than through external oversight. July 1978 meant midsummer in Tennessee hills, where hot weather made outdoor labor difficult and where seasonal agricultural work was intense preparing for harvest that would determine families' economic situations through remainder of year, month also marked period when Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms was conducting aggressive investigations throughout rural regions, targeting suspected firearms violations that gun control legislation passed during 1960s had made federal offenses prosecutable through raids and arrests that communities often viewed as governmental overreach against Second Amendment rights that rural populations defended intensely. Honeycutt clan was extended family group consisting of approximately 47 members, spanning 4 generations from patriarch Ezra Honeycutt, age 73, down through his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, ranging in ages from infants to adults in their 50s, family that had lived on 200-acre compound in Hawkins County since 1890s, when Ezra's grandfather had established property and had begun tradition of keeping family together through successive generations rather than dispersing as children married and established independent households. Ezra had maintained family cohesion through combination of personal authority, through providing economic support that compound's agricultural operations generated, through emphasizing values of family loyalty and mutual support that mountain culture had traditionally celebrated, creating situation where clan functioned almost as self-contained community with internal governance and with limited interactions with external institutions beyond what economic transactions or legal requirements made necessary. ATF raid on Honeycutt compound had occurred July 14, 1978, when combined federal and state task force consisting of 27 officers, led by ATF agent Marcus Webb, had arrived with warrant alleging that Ezra and other Klan members were maintaining illegal firearms, including weapons that modifications had rendered violations of National Firearms Act requiring registration and taxation that family allegedly hadn't complied with. Warrant authorized searching compound and arresting any individuals found possessing illegal weapons or who were determined to have violated federal firearms regulations. Raid had been planned for months following investigation that confidential informant had initiated. Through reporting that Honeycutt Klan was manufacturing modified weapons and was selling firearms without required licenses that federal law mandated for commercial transactions. Confrontation had developed when Ezra had refused to allow officers onto property without Klan attorney being present, verbal resistance that ATF agents had characterized as obstruction. When Ezra had positioned himself, blocking gateway preventing vehicles from entering compound, standoff had lasted approximately 30 minutes, while officers had attempted persuading Ezra to comply, and while family attorney had been contacted and was en route from office 20 miles distant. But Agent William Harrison had determined that waiting for attorney was unnecessary delay, had ordered officers to physically remove Ezra from gateway, allowing task force to enter and conduct authorized search. Physical confrontation that had resulted when Ezra had continued blocking entrance, verbally protesting that constitutional rights required allowing legal representation to be present during search of private property. 6 officers had forcibly removed Ezra from gateway, struggle that witnesses, including approximately 15 family members, who'd gathered observing confrontation described as excessive force employed against elderly man whose resistance had been passive positioning rather than active violence. Officers had tackled Ezra to ground and had placed him in restraints, despite Ezra's verbal protests that he wasn't resisting arrest, but was merely exercising constitutional rights to have attorney present during search. Medical evidence would later document that Ezra had suffered 3 broken ribs and concussion during restraint process, injuries that officers would claim had resulted from Ezra's resistance requiring force to overcome, but that witnesses, including family physician who examined Ezra, would characterize as excessive trauma, inconsistent with subduing non-violent subject who'd been standing passively blocking entrance, rather than attacking officers or attempting to flee. Search of compound had proceeded while Ezra had been transported to county jail. Search that had discovered firearms collection that family maintained, but that had found no illegal weapons or modifications that warrant had alleged existed. Discovered weapons had been standard rifles and shotguns, that legal ownership required no special licensing, and that Second Amendment protected as legitimate possessions. Absence of illegal weapons had suggested that informants' allegations had been inaccurate or fabricated, but hadn't prevented Ezra's continued detention on charges of obstruction and resisting arrest that prosecutors could pursue even when underlying firearms allegations couldn't be proven. Ezra had been denied medical treatment for broken ribs and concussion during initial 24 hours in custody. Complaints about pain and about difficulty breathing had been dismissed by jail medical staff who'd characterized symptoms as normal discomfort from arrest rather than as injuries requiring immediate attention. Denial of treatment had continued until family attorney had threatened litigation and had contacted media creating publicity that had forced authorities to transport Ezra to hospital, where X-rays had confirmed broken ribs and where concussion had been diagnosed, requiring hospitalization for observation. Medical records documented that injuries had occurred during arrest and that delayed treatment had created risks of complications that immediate care would have prevented. Documentation provided evidence that could support excessive force complaints and civil rights litigation that family was preparing to pursue against officers and agencies involved in raid. Family's decision to systematically eliminate 13 officers involved in raid was collective determination made during Klan meeting held July 16th, 2 days after Ezra's arrest and 1 day after hospitalization had confirmed severity of injuries that authorities had initially denied required treatment. Decision represented coordinated response by multiple family members, rather than individual vengeance that previous cases had involved, creating a situation where systematic campaign would be executed by several Honeycutt clan members working cooperatively to identify targets, to plan attacks and to carry out eliminations using methods that families' collective technical knowledge made possible. The method of electrocution had been chosen because multiple family members possessed expertise in electrical systems, through work in construction trades and through compounds maintenance requiring knowledge of wiring and power distribution, technical skills that clan members applied to creating electrocution devices and traps that would kill officers efficiently while allowing perpetrators to maintain distance, avoiding detection that direct confrontations would have created. Planning had involved identifying officers' routines and locations, determining where electrical systems could be accessed or modified, preparing equipment that would deliver fatal currents when activated either remotely or through automated triggers that victims' actions would initiate, coordination that demonstrated sophisticated organizational capabilities exceeding what individual vengeance campaigns had typically employed. The systematic elimination began July 15th, when Agent William Harrison, who'd ordered Ezra's forcible removal, was found dead in his car, electrocuted through modified vehicle electrical system that investigation would determine had been altered to deliver high-voltage current through steering wheel and through seat. When ignition was activated, killing that demonstrated technical knowledge about automotive electrical systems and access to Harrison's vehicle that modification required. Harrison's death created immediate concern throughout law enforcement community, where electrocution as murder method was unusual enough to raise questions about whether death represented accident from faulty wiring or represented deliberate assassination using sophisticated techniques that professional expertise would enable. Deputy Thomas Mitchell, who'd been among 6 officers who tackled Ezra, died July 18th when attempting to enter his home. Electrocuted through doorknob, that investigation would discover had been wired to electrical panel, delivering fatal voltage when touched, while standing on wet ground that recent rain had created. Trap that demonstrated knowledge of electrical principles, including understanding that current required path to ground for completing circuit that would kill victim. Mitchell's death confirmed pattern when investigators recognized similarities to Harrison's electrocution. Realization prompted heightened security for surviving raid participants and initiated intensive investigation attempting to identify perpetrators before additional killings occurred. Pattern continued throughout late July and August, with officers dying through various electrocution methods, including modified light switches delivering fatal currents, shower fixtures altered to become electrified when water created conductive path, telephone handsets rewired to deliver high voltage when lifted, vehicle electrical systems modified similarly to Harrison's car, diverse techniques creating uncertainty about specific methods that would be employed, and making protection difficult when electrocution could occur through any electrical device or fixture that tampering could transform into fatal trap. Deaths demonstrated not only technical sophistication, but also intelligence gathering about officers' routines and locations, allowing clan members to access vehicles, homes, offices, where modifications could be installed without being observed. Coordination suggesting that multiple family members were participating in surveillance and in executing attacks. By September 8th, 13 officers were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, ATF, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, deploying hundreds of agents attempting to identify perpetrators and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of all raid participants within 8 weeks demonstrated capability and coordination that authorities hadn't anticipated from family group whose compound residents had suggested isolation from mainstream society rather than technical sophistication that electrical expertise required. Investigation had focused quickly on Honeycutt clan, given obvious motive following Ezra's arrest and injuries, but establishing which specific family members had participated in planning or executing electrocutions proved difficult when clans' collective loyalty meant that members refused cooperating with authorities and when technical evidence linking specific individuals to modifications was limited. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed 3 Honeycutt clan members: James Honeycutt, age 48, who was Ezra's eldest son, Robert Honeycutt, age 32, who was Ezra's grandson, and Daniel Honeycutt, age 27, who was another grandson. Accessing vehicle belonging to officer who raid records showed had been present during arrest. Surveillance team intervened before modifications could be completed. Arrests that prevented additional deaths and that provided physical evidence, including electrical equipment and diagrams showing other officers' vehicles and residences marked for targeting. Searches of compound following arrests discovered workshop containing electrical equipment, diagrams showing multiple officers' properties with notations about electrical systems, lists tracking which targets had been eliminated and which remained, evidence demonstrating that systematic campaign had been coordinated effort involving at minimum 3 family members working cooperatively. But investigation's most disturbing discovery was evidence suggesting that broader clan participation had extended beyond 3 arrested members. Documents and testimony indicated that other family members had provided surveillance information, had manufactured equipment, had provided alibis, had maintained collective silence protecting participants. Involvement creating questions about how many Honeycutt clan members bore criminal responsibility for 13 electrocutions when prosecution would need to prove specific individuals' roles rather than merely demonstrating that family as collective entity had participated in conspiracy. Federal prosecutors determined that sufficient evidence existed to charge James, Robert, and Daniel with 13 murders and with conspiracy, but recognized that proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt would require demonstrating that each defendant had participated in specific killings rather than proving only that clan collectively had engaged in systematic campaign. Trial for 13 murders occurred in February 1979 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where 3 Honeycutt defendants faced prosecution for killing federal and state law enforcement officers, case that attracted national media attention, both because electrocution as systematic murder method was highly unusual and because prosecution of family group for coordinated violence raised questions about collective responsibility that criminal law typically addressed through conspiracy doctrines, requiring proof of individual participation in shared criminal enterprise. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including electrical equipment recovered from defendants when arrested, diagrams showing officers' properties, surveillance footage documenting Robert and Daniel accessing victims' vehicles, workshop at compound containing materials matching those used in modifications, systematic pattern proving that 13 electrocutions represented coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents. Defense didn't dispute that 3 defendants had participated in planning and executing systematic electrocutions, but argued that actions had been desperate response to excessive force that had injured elderly family patriarch and to denial of medical treatment that authorities had employed despite knowing that Ezra's injuries required immediate care, presented medical evidence documenting broken ribs and concussion, presented testimony from witnesses who'd observed officers tackling Ezra despite his passive resistance, presented jail medical records showing that treatment had been denied for 24 hours, despite complaints about pain and breathing difficulties. Defense also emphasized that Raid had discovered no illegal weapons, meaning that underlying justification for confrontation had been invalid. That informant's allegations had been fabricated or mistaken, making entire operation based on false premises that proper investigation would have detected before authorizing raid, that constitutional protections should have prevented when probable cause was lacking. Most dramatic defense evidence came from use of force experts, who testified that officers' tactics during Ezra's arrest had been excessive given that his resistance had been verbal and positional rather than violent or threatening. Experts explained that subduing elderly man through tackle requiring 6 officers had been disproportionate to threat level, and that injuries resulting from such force demonstrated that training or supervision had been inadequate for ensuring that arrests were conducted using minimum force necessary for compliance. Experts testified that denial of medical treatment following arrest had compounded constitutional violations, that jail protocols should have recognized symptoms suggesting serious injuries requiring immediate evaluation, that 24-hour delay had been systematic failure rather than isolated oversight, when multiple staff had been informed about Ezra's complaints. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of whether force had been excessive, and regardless of whether medical treatment had been wrongly denied, systematic assassination of 13 law enforcement officers through sophisticated electrocution methods constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming that family members were avenging injuries to patriarch. That proper response to excessive force would have been civil litigation and criminal complaints against officers, rather than employing coordinated violence that had killed people who may have had varying degrees of involvement in Ezra's injuries. Prosecutors noted that victims had included officers whose participation in raid had been peripheral, that some had been present without actively participating in tackling Ezra, and that others had been jail staff whose role had been limited to following medical protocols that supervisors should have corrected when reviewing prisoner complaints. Jury deliberated 19 days before returning guilty verdicts against all 3 defendants on all 13 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee federal court history, reflected unprecedented complexity, evaluating collective action by family members, responding to injuries that evidence suggested had resulted from excessive force. Deliberations that required jurors to assess whether each defendant's specific participation in each killing had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, rather than merely establishing that Klan collectively had engaged in systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply conflicted about case. That evidence of excessive force during Ezra's arrest had created sympathy for families' grievances, but that systematic nature of electrocution campaign and technical sophistication demonstrated through planning had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders, rather than spontaneous violence that desperation might have partially excused. Judge sentenced each defendant to life imprisonment, without parole on each count to be served consecutively. Effective life sentences, acknowledging severity of killing 13 officers through coordinated family conspiracy, while also noting that death penalty had been considered but rejected due to questions about degrees of individual culpability when evidence suggested broader Klan participation beyond 3 defendants who'd been prosecuted. Sentencing created controversies when civil liberties advocates argued that punishments were excessive, given provocation that excessive force had created, while law enforcement organizations maintained that any leniency would send dangerous message, that families could employ violence against officers who were performing duties that legal authority authorized even when specific tactics might have exceeded appropriate force levels. James Honeycutt died in federal prison in 2015 at age 85 from natural causes. Robert Honeycutt remained imprisoned serving sentence at age 78 in 2024. Daniel Honeycutt similarly remained imprisoned at age 73. 2 surviving defendants whose continued incarceration, 46 years after crimes, had created ongoing debates about whether life sentences without possibility of release were appropriate for defendants whose actions had been motivated by family loyalty, responding to injuries that authorities had acknowledged, resulted from excessive force and from delayed medical treatment. Ezra Honeycutt had died in 1992 at age 87, had lived 14 years following raid, and had witnessed sons and grandsons imprisoned for avenging injuries that he'd characterized as devastating violations of dignity and bodily autonomy that elderly man had no capacity for defending against when 6 officers had employed overwhelming force. The late 20th century brought renewed attention to Honeycutt case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained ATF and FBI files through Freedom of Information requests. Documents revealed that informant whose allegations had justified raid had been paid asset with history of providing questionable information to justify operations, that ATF supervisors had received warnings about informant's reliability but had proceeded with raid because firearms enforcement was priority, that political pressures demanded demonstrate aggressive action, regardless of whether specific intelligence was verified adequately. Morrison published findings in 2005 book titled Tennessee Reckoning: How Excessive Force Against Family Patriarch Created Electrocution. Avengers, comprehensive examination documenting informant's unreliability, raid finding no illegal weapons, excessive force during Ezra's arrest, denial of medical treatment, systematic electrocution campaign, trial and imprisonment, ongoing debates about appropriate punishment for family members avenging patriarch's injuries. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF supervisors had known before raid that informant had provided false intelligence in previous operations, resulting in searches finding no violations. That despite this history, supervisors had authorized Honeycutt raid without independent verification, because firearms enforcement statistics were being scrutinized, and because conducting operations demonstrated agency was addressing gun control priorities, that congressional oversight was demanding show results. Internal communications revealed that Agent Marcus Webb, who'd led raid, had expressed concerns about informant reliability to supervisors who'd dismissed reservations, explaining that statistics required conducting operations and that finding no violations during searches didn't invalidate intelligence when targets might have disposed of weapons before raids occurred. Culture that prioritized demonstrating enforcement activity over ensuring that operations were based on verified probable cause that constitutional standards required. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced Comprehensive Examination in 2012, film titled Family Against Federal Authority, Honeycutt Clan's Electrocution Campaign, featuring interviews with law enforcement experts, constitutional scholars, Morrison discussing research findings, remaining Honeycutt Clan members expressing perspectives about whether systematic electrocutions had been justified response to excessive force, or whether violence had exceeded what patriarch's injuries warranted, even acknowledging that officers' behavior had been indefensible. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both excessive force that medical evidence documented and 13 deaths affecting families, regardless of deceased officers' individual degrees of culpability for raid's excessive tactics. Most powerful segment featured interview with Martha Honeycutt, age 81 in 2012. Ezra's widow, who'd witnessed husband being tackled by 6 officers and who'd spent years advocating for imprisoned family members, Martha explained that watching federal agents tackle 73-year-old Ezra, who was merely standing blocking gateway, asking for attorney to be present, seeing him thrown to ground and hearing ribs crack while grandchildren were screaming, then having authorities deny him medical treatment, claiming injuries weren't serious, destroyed our trust in system that supposedly protects citizens from government excess, made us understand that sometimes families must defend themselves when institutions demonstrate they won't provide accountability for officers who injure elderly people through employing force that situations don't justify. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 13 killed officers. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained that relatives had been murder victims, regardless of excessive force context, to those who acknowledged that deceased family members had participated in raid that informants' false intelligence had justified, and that had employed tactics exceeding appropriate force levels. Several families described how learning details about informants' history and about ATF supervisors' knowledge had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had created situation where family group had employed desperate measures that systematic coordination made particularly deadly. Federal government conducted review in 2013 examining ATF operations based on paid informant intelligence. Review identified systematic patterns where informants with questionable reliability had been used to justify raids and arrests that statistics required demonstrating enforcement activity regardless of whether operations produced valid violations. That supervisors had prioritized activity metrics over ensuring that constitutional standards for probable cause were satisfied before authorizing searches that Fourth Amendment theoretically required be based on reliable information. Review concluded that, while evidence of ATF operational problems is substantial and clearly demonstrates that supervisors systematically authorized raids based on questionable intelligence, federal statutes don't provide mechanisms for posthumously acknowledging institutional failures in cases where defendants' subsequent violence creates complications, preventing recognition without appearing to condone systematic killings that resulted from those failures. Federal government established Memorial and Educational Center in 2014 at Hawkins County Courthouse. Memorial documented case through multiple perspectives, including ATF firearms enforcement context during 1970s, informant's history providing false intelligence, raid finding no illegal weapons, excessive force during Ezra's arrest witnessed by family members, denial of medical treatment for 24 hours, systematic electrocution campaign employing sophisticated electrical modifications, arrests preventing additional killings, trial examining collective family responsibility, imprisonment of 3 defendants, newly discovered documents showing supervisors' knowledge about informant problems, debates about justified family defense versus excessive coordinated violence. Central exhibit featured technical diagrams that FBI had recovered, showing electrical modifications Klan members had designed for killing officers. Visitors could see sophisticated engineering that demonstrated substantial expertise, could examine equipment used for delivering fatal voltages, could view surveillance photographs showing defendants accessing victims' vehicles, physical evidence demonstrating that electrocution campaign had been carefully planned rather than representing spontaneous responses to rage. Exhibit included expert testimony from electrical engineers explaining how modifications had been designed to deliver current sufficient for causing immediate cardiac arrest, describing how safety devices had been bypassed to ensure that victims couldn't interrupt circuits before fatal doses were received. Memorial Room honored both Ezra Honeycutt, whose injuries had motivated families' systematic violence, and 13 law enforcement officers who'd been killed during coordinated campaign. Memorial acknowledged that victims included elderly patriarch, whose constitutional rights had been violated through excessive force, and officers whose participation in flawed operation had resulted in deaths affecting families. Memorial included video recording from 2012 interview with remaining Honeycutt Klan members, explaining how family had maintained cohesion despite 3 members' imprisonments, and how collective decision to avenge Ezra's injuries had been motivated by cultural values, emphasizing family loyalty and mutual defense when external threats attacked members. Museum's final exhibit examined broader question that Honeycutt case raised about appropriate responses when law enforcement employs excessive force against family members and when systems refuse accountability for injuries. Memorial wall posed question, what should families do when authorities injure loved ones through employing force exceeding threats presented and when official channels refuse? Acknowledging constitutional violations, alongside competing responses, emphasizing that legal remedies exist for excessive force claims and that systematic violence, regardless of provocations, cannot be justified when rule of law depends on channeling grievances through institutional processes rather than through private retribution. By 2024, Honeycutt case remained most studied example in courses examining collective criminal responsibility and examining family resistance to government authority, case studied in law school seminars about conspiracy law and about how group dynamics affect culpability when multiple participants coordinate violence, discussed in law enforcement training about importance of employing minimum force necessary and about ensuring that medical care is provided to prisoners whose complaints suggest serious injuries. Modern constitutional rights advocates invoke Honeycutt as symbol of how excessive force creates grievances that families may respond to through collective action, argue that systematic electrocution campaign, while legally unjustifiable, was psychologically comprehensible response to violations that institutional accountability should have addressed before desperation motivated violence. Congressional hearings in 2015 examining law enforcement use of force cited Honeycutt case when questioning whether adequate accountability exists preventing officers from employing tactics exceeding threats that situations present. Testimony from civil rights organizations and from use of force experts suggested that problems similar to those that had motivated Honeycutt violence continued occurring when officers lacked proper training or when cultures within agencies tolerated aggressive tactics that policies theoretically prohibited. Hearings resulted in recommendations for strengthening use of force training, for establishing independent review when force results in injuries, for ensuring that medical care is provided immediately when prisoners exhibit symptoms suggesting trauma, for prohibiting use of paid informants with histories of providing false intelligence unless independent verification confirms reliability. Federal legislation passed in 2016 established Ezra Honeycutt Excessive Force Accountability Act, requiring federal law enforcement agencies to implement independent review processes when force during arrests results in injuries requiring hospitalization, to establish medical protocols, ensuring that prisoners receive immediate evaluation when exhibiting symptoms of trauma, to maintain databases tracking officers whose use of force results in injuries, allowing identification of patterns suggesting training deficiencies or aggressive tendencies. Legislation was named for Ezra, recognizing that his case had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards that individual agency initiatives had been inadequate for implementing consistently. Under new statute, Department of Justice began reviewing approximately 600 historical cases from 1970-2000 period, where use of force during arrests had resulted in serious injuries or deaths. Reviews focused particularly on incidents involving elderly suspects or situations where resistance had been verbal rather than physical, threatening officers' safety. Reviews resulted in 38 official acknowledgments where evidence demonstrated that force had been excessive and that medical care had been wrongly delayed. Outcomes that Honeycutt advocates characterized as vindication, demonstrating that excessive force wasn't an isolated incident, but represented systematic problems affecting federal law enforcement's relationship with communities. Tennessee established Comprehensive Use of Force Training Center in 2017 near Hawkins County. Center provided programming about constitutional standards requiring minimum force necessary for compliance, about recognizing when resistance is passive rather than threatening requiring graduated responses, about ensuring medical care when arrests result in injuries, about understanding that families will view force against elderly or vulnerable members as violations deserving accountability, regardless of whether official investigations conclude that tactics were justified. Educational programs emphasized that maintaining community trust required not only following policies, but ensuring that force employed was proportional to actual threats rather than to perceived disrespect or to frustrations about suspects' resistance. Historical marker installed at Honeycutt compound in 2018 reflected balanced approach, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading: Honeycutt Clan 1978 systematically electrocuted 13 law enforcement officers following ATF raid on family compound based on false informant intelligence. Raid found no illegal weapons, but resulted in excessive force arrest of patriarch Ezra Honeycutt, age 73, who suffered broken ribs and concussion when 6 officers tackled him for verbally blocking gateway while requesting attorney. Medical treatment denied 24 hours despite complaints. 3 family members coordinated electrocution campaign using sophisticated electrical modifications targeting raid participants. Convicted after 19-day jury deliberation examining collective responsibility. Sentenced life imprisonment without parole. Case prompted federal reforms including Ezra Honeycutt Excessive Force Accountability Act, establishing review procedures. This site reminds us that excessive force against family members creates grievances that collective action may respond to, that institutional accountability must address constitutional violations before desperation motivates coordinated violence, that families will defend members when systems demonstrate unwillingness to punish officers whose tactics exceed threats presented. Comparative analysis examining Honeycutt's 13 victims revealed complex picture where 6, including Harrison, had been directly involved in tackling Ezra or in denying medical treatment. 5 had been raid participants whose roles had involved securing perimeter or conducting searches without direct involvement in arrest. 2 had been supervisors whose responsibilities had included authorizing raid based on informant intelligence and reviewing use of force reports without identifying excessive tactics. This distribution raised questions about whether electrocution campaign should have distinguished among degrees of culpability rather than treating all participants as equally responsible. Whether killing 2 supervisors and 5 peripheral participants represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that core group had employed unjustified force against elderly man. Honeycutt defendants' appeals had consistently argued that collective punishment was inappropriate, when evidence suggested that James had been primary organizer, that Robert and Daniel had participated following elder family members' direction, creating coercion dynamics that criminal law recognized as mitigation, that 3 shouldn't receive identical sentences when their roles likely varied in planning and executing specific electrocutions. But appellate courts had rejected arguments, explaining that conspiracy law held all participants equally responsible for foreseeable deaths resulting from coordinated criminal enterprise, that evidence proved each defendant had participated actively rather than merely providing passive support, that lesser culpability might justify. Descendants of Honeycutt, including James's daughter Patricia Honeycutt, age 58 in 2024, expressed nuanced perspectives about fathers and relatives' systematic violence. Patricia acknowledged that killing 13 people had created victims whose families suffered regardless of whether deceased officers had actively employed excessive force or had merely been present during raid, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing family dynamics, where loyalty to patriarch was paramount cultural value, and where defending Ezra when authorities had injured him was viewed as moral obligation, transcending legal prohibitions against violence. Patricia's balanced position created some controversy within broader civil liberties advocacy community, where some argued that any focus on family loyalty risked romanticizing violence, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing cultural contexts where extended families functioned almost as sovereign entities with internal governance and defense obligations. Federal legislation establishing excessive force accountability prompted examination of broader patterns, where law enforcement had historically employed tactics that situations didn't justify. Department of Justice analysis, examining approximately 1,800 use-of-force incidents from 1970-2010 period, identified systematic patterns where officers had employed force against suspects whose resistance had been passive or verbal rather than threatening immediate violence. That training emphasizing compliance and control had inadequately prepared officers for graduated responses that constitutional standards required when suspects weren't presenting dangers, justifying aggressive subduing techniques. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive use-of-force training, emphasizing de-escalation as primary tactic, for establishing strict accountability when force results in serious injuries, for implementing immediate medical evaluation requirements when arrests involve any use of force beyond handcuffing cooperative suspects, for prohibiting multiple officers employing simultaneous force against single suspects, unless specific threats justify overwhelming numbers. Recommendations that Honeycutt advocates characterized as vindication of warnings about enforcement culture, tolerating excessive tactics, though critics noted that acknowledging problems 40 years later provided little benefit to Ezra, who died decades earlier, and to 3 family members who'd spent lifetimes imprisoned. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Honeycutt case emphasizes that respecting suspects' dignity serves practical function beyond abstract commitment to constitutional rights, that employing force exceeding threats presented creates grievances affecting not only individuals, but entire family networks whose collective responses can be far more dangerous than isolated victims' reactions. That maintaining community relationships requires ensuring that every arrest is conducted using minimum force necessary, rather than employing tactics that demonstrate authority through overwhelming displays of power. Training materials cite specific example of tackling elderly man blocking gateway, resulting in 13 deaths as demonstration that excessive force creates cascading harms affecting officers and communities whose safety depends on trust, that law enforcement will employ proportional responses rather than aggressive tactics that situations don't justify. International law enforcement organizations examining use of force standards frequently cite Honeycutt case as example from United States, demonstrating consequences when officers lack proper training or when cultures tolerate aggressive tactics, while noting that collective family responses aren't unique to American context, but occur globally where extended kinship networks function as mutual defense organizations responding to threats against members through coordinated action that modern legal systems struggle to address, when individualistic frameworks assume that responsibility is personal rather than collective. By 2024, 46 years after Electrocution campaign, descendants of some 13 killed officers had established dialogue with Honeycutt family members, efforts that had been initiated by Jennifer Mitchell, age 52, whose father, Deputy Thomas Mitchell, had been electrocuted through doorknob trap. Jennifer had contacted Patricia Honeycutt, explaining that understanding family's perspective was necessary for achieving closure and for addressing unresolved questions about whether her father's participation in raid had been knowing contribution to excessive force or had been following orders without understanding that tactics would violate constitutional standards. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services, where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic violence or defending family loyalty couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some officers' families maintained that dialogue with clan whose members had murdered relatives was inappropriate, regardless of excessive force context, argued that focus should remain on 13 deaths rather than on injuries that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Honeycutt clan members opposed reconciliation, explaining that 3 family members remained imprisoned serving life sentences and that engagement with victims' families suggested acceptance of legal systems' judgment, when actually they viewed prosecutions as unjust responses to defensive actions, protecting patriarch from governmental abuse. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including Ezra, whose injuries had been documented, and 13 officers whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how institutional failures and family dynamics had combined, creating tragedy, affecting multiple generations. Modern scholarship examining Honeycutt case within broader context of family resistance to government authority has revealed that coordinated electrocution campaign, while extreme in its sophistication and lethality, represented one among numerous incidents during 1970s-1980s, where extended family groups had responded collectively to perceived governmental overreach. That Ruby Ridge incident in 1992 and Waco siege in 1993 would later demonstrate that clan-like groups' violent resistance to federal authority remained persistent pattern requiring different approaches than individualistic legal frameworks assumed were appropriate for addressing threats and for ensuring compliance. Comprehensive analyses examining family-based resistance movements have emphasized that Honeycutt case exemplified dynamics where patriarchal authority within extended kinship networks created situations where loyalty to family exceeded loyalty to external legal systems, where protecting or avenging family leaders was viewed as moral obligation, transcending prohibitions against violence that modern states claimed monopoly over through criminal law. What distinguished Honeycutt case from other family resistance incidents was combination of electrocution as method requiring technical sophistication, unusual in rural contexts, coordinated participation by multiple family members, working cooperatively, rather than following single leaders' directives, systematic targeting of specific individuals based on documented participation in raid, rather than general anti-government violence, successful completion of entire target list before being apprehended, trial raising unprecedented questions about collective criminal responsibility when conspiracy involved family members whose cultural obligations might have created coercion that individualistic culpability assessments inadequately captured. Most family resistance cases had involved standoffs or defensive violence when authorities attempted arrests or searches, had been resolved through negotiations or through tactical operations, had resulted in prosecutions of individuals who'd been identified as leaders rather than treating entire family groups as collectively responsible for coordinated campaigns. Jennifer Mitchell's reconciliation work with Honeycutt family had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her father had been peripheral participant in raid, had been assigned to secure compound perimeter, and hadn't been among 6 officers who'd tackled Ezra, or among medical staff who'd denied treatment. Revelation had created questions about whether electrocution targeting her father had been excessive response, when his participation had been limited to following assignment without direct involvement in constitutional violations. Jennifer's conversations with Patricia Honeycutt had revealed that Klan members who'd planned campaign hadn't distinguished among participants' roles, had viewed everyone present during raid as collectively responsible for institutional action that had injured patriarch, regardless of whether specific individuals had employed force or had merely been performing peripheral duties. This lack of distinction had become central controversy during appeals, when defendants had argued that treating all raid participants as equally culpable had been excessive, even if coordinated violence against those directly responsible might have been comprehensible, desperate response. Courts had rejected arguments explaining that defendants rather than victims bore responsibility for determining who to target, and that choosing to kill peripheral participants demonstrated that violence had exceeded defensive purposes and had become retributive campaign deserving unqualified condemnation. Debate continued among scholars examining whether criminal law's focus on perpetrators' intentions rather than on victims' culpability was appropriate framework for evaluating cases where collective grievances motivated selection of targets whose individual responsibilities varied significantly. Federal legislation establishing review procedures for excessive force incidents had been implemented unevenly across agencies. Department of Justice reports examining compliance during 2020-2024 period revealed that while formal review processes had been established, cultural resistance within law enforcement to external oversight had meant that reviews often concluded force was justified even when evidence suggested that tactics had exceeded threats, that medical protocols ensuring immediate evaluation had been implemented more successfully than accountability mechanisms when treating injuries was less controversial than disciplining officers whose force had caused trauma. Implementation challenges that Honeycutt advocates pointed to as demonstrating that systemic reforms required not just establishing procedures, but changing cultures that had historically prioritized protecting officers over acknowledging when tactics violated constitutional standards. Contemporary debates about Honeycutt case reflected broader conflicts about limits of family loyalty when governments employ force against members, about whether collective responses to institutional failures can ever be morally defensible, even when legally criminal, about how societies should balance sympathy for grievances against condemnation of coordinated violence creating multiple victims. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning systematic murders rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify coordinated electrocution campaign. Modern constitutional rights movements invoke Honeycutt as example of why robust accountability for excessive force is essential for preventing family groups from employing collective violence when institutional channels refuse addressing violations, argue that case demonstrates that families will defend members through coordinated action when systems demonstrate unwillingness to discipline officers whose tactics injure people who weren't presenting threats, justifying aggressive force. Critics counter that emphasizing family loyalty risks romanticizing clan-based violence and undermining rule of law, even when acknowledging that specific force incidents were excessive. That overwhelming majority of families respond to excessive force through legal channels rather than through sophisticated murder campaigns that Honeycutt electrocutions represented. The enduring questions that Honeycutt case raises about limits of justified collective action when responding to excessive force, about appropriate exercise of government authority when conducting raids, about whether families should be held collectively responsible for members' coordinated violence, about how societies should memorialize events where institutional failures and family dynamics combined creating tragedies affecting multiple communities, these remain unresolved 46 years after events, continue shaping debates about use of force standards, about family resistance to government authority, about conspiracy law's application to kinship groups whose cultural obligations create coercion dynamics, that individualistic responsibility frameworks inadequately capture. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions employ excessive tactics and when families respond through coordinated violence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about constitutional violations and systematic murders affecting officers and families, regardless of whether victims had directly participated in force that had injured Ezra. The broader implications of Honeycutt case extended beyond individual tragedy, when modern researchers examining family-based resistance movements discovered that electrocution campaign had represented emerging pattern during late 20th century, where extended kinship networks had been responding collectively to governmental actions perceived as threats to family autonomy. That subsequent incidents, including Ruby Ridge and Waco, had demonstrated that federal law enforcement had inadequately understood how to approach insular family groups whose internal governance and mutual defense obligations created situations where standard enforcement tactics provoked coordinated violence rather than individual compliance that modern legal systems assumed was normal response to governmental authority. Comprehensive studies examining clan-based resistance revealed that Honeycutt case hadn't been an isolated incident, but had exemplified broader phenomenon where patriarchal family structures maintained collective identities, resisting external interference through coordinated defensive or retributive actions that conventional law enforcement struggled to prevent or to prosecute effectively when individualistic legal frameworks assumed that responsibility was personal rather than collective. Until next time, remember that Honeycutt clan systematically electrocuted 13 law enforcement officers following ATF raid based on false informant intelligence that found no illegal weapons but resulted in excessive force arrest of patriarch Ezra Honeycutt, whose broken ribs and concussion from being tackled by 6 officers weren't treated for 24 hours despite complaints. That 3 family members coordinated sophisticated electrical modifications targeting all raid participants, including peripheral officers whose direct involvement had been limited. That 19-day jury deliberation examined collective responsibility before convicting all defendants of all counts. That case prompted federal reforms including Ezra Honeycutt Excessive Force Accountability Act, requiring independent review when arrests result in injuries, and that ultimately excessive force against family members creates grievances that collective kinship networks may respond to through coordinated violence, affecting entire communities when institutional accountability fails to address constitutional violations before desperation and family loyalty motivate systematic retribution that modern legal systems struggle to prevent or to adequately punish. When conspiracy doctrines assume individual rather than cultural obligations, drive participation in coordinated criminal enterprises. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of collective family action and excessive force across 46 years, the discovery that ATF raid was based on paid informant with history of providing false intelligence that supervisors knew about but authorized operation anyway for enforcement statistics. The tackling of 73-year-old Ezra by 6 officers when his resistance was merely standing blocking gateway verbally requesting attorney, the denial of medical treatment for broken ribs and concussion despite complaints until family attorney threatened litigation, the systematic electrocution of 13 officers through sophisticated electrical modifications requiring technical expertise that multiple family members coordinated. The 19-day jury deliberation examining whether collective conspiracy made all participants equally culpable, or whether family loyalty created coercion that individualistic responsibility inadequately captured. The federal legislation requiring independent review named for Ezra. The reconciliation dialogue between officers' families and Honeycutt clan examining whether peripheral victims should have been distinguished from direct participants. The impossible questions about whether coordinated family defense can ever be justified when responding to excessive force, and whether collective punishment is appropriate when cultural obligations rather than individual choices motivated participation. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how excessive force creates family grievances, How collective kinship networks respond to institutional failures through coordinated violence. How conspiracy law addresses clan-based resistance when cultural obligations exceed legal prohibitions. Comment about whether systematic electrocutions were proportional family defense or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite slow institutional responses. Whether 46 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when 3 defendants remain imprisoned, serving life sentences. Whether memorial should emphasize excessive force violations or acknowledge 13 deaths affecting officers' families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in raid. Because these questions persist wherever extended families maintain collective identities, wherever government authority employs force against family members, wherever institutional accountability fails to address constitutional violations, before loyalty and desperation motivate coordinated responses that modern legal systems condemn as criminal conspiracies, while cultural frameworks view as moral obligations protecting members. When external threats demonstrate that official channels won't provide justice that family defense requires, when systems systematically refuse holding officers accountable for employing tactics exceeding threats that situations present and creating injuries that medical care should immediately address, rather than dismissing as normal discomfort deserving no treatment. The enduring legacy of Honeycutt Clan's 1978 coordinated electrocution campaign continues influencing how federal law enforcement agencies approach operations involving insular family groups, how use of force training emphasizes graduated responses proportional to actual threats rather than perceived disrespect, how criminal law addresses collective responsibility when cultural obligations motivate participation in coordinated violence, demonstrating that 46 years after systematic murders that resulted from excessive force and delayed medical treatment, fundamental questions about family loyalty versus legal authority, about collective versus individual culpability, about institutional accountability for constitutional violations, remain unresolved despite reforms and despite reconciliation efforts, requiring continued examination of how government authority should be exercised respectfully and how families should respond when systems fail, protecting members from excessive force that modern legal frameworks condemn, but that clan-based cultures may view as attacks demanding coordinated defensive responses that kinship obligations require, regardless of criminal prohibitions that. Individualistic. Societies impose assuming that loyalty to law exceeds loyalty to family, when actually for many populations throughout history and across cultures, extended kinship networks have functioned as primary governance and mutual defense organizations whose collective identities and protective obligations transcend modern states' claims to monopoly over legitimate violence.